good evening, and thanks to all of you who've stayed with this series. Tonight, we have a great treat in store. Canon Mark Clavier from Brecon Cathedral is going to join in the conversation. Mark is, I hope I'm describing him correctly, as a historical theologian. He has published books on Augustine and also related Augustine to the stewardship of creation. And he also has a very sturdy foothold in the 17th century, so two periods of very great interest to anyone who's curious about how state and church might have encountered each other in previous times. So the idea is we will converse together for about half an hour, and then the floor is open, and we hope that as many of you as possible will then join in. So, yeah. So, Mark, would you really like to tell us something about these two very, very different but very important periods in the life of the church that have been your research field?
Yeah. So, in some ways, very different. I guess a bit of background. I began much more in the 17th century when I was training for the ministry in Durham, North Carolina. Many moons ago, I was focusing much of my research on a group of people known as the Caroline Divines. You could roughly describe them as the high church party in Anglicanism during the reign of King Charles I. And I stuck with that period for quite some time in my research. And that's an interesting period, of course, because of the whole build-up to the British Civil Wars and the disagreements that would break out in Parliament and ultimately in warfare, being centered on what we would now call theological questions, namely, how reformed would the Church of England be? Had the Reformation not gone far enough, or had it gone too far, which is roughly the two different groups of that conflict in England. I only later, much later, after many years of ministry, moved to late antiquity and focusing my research on Augustine. And while my own research on Augustine was focused on his idea of delight, and many people would not equate Augustine with delight, but he's full of delight. Augustine is perhaps better known for his great tome of a book, The City of God, which very much describes the place of the church in the world, dividing the world or our experience of the world into the worldly city, manifested in his own time by the city of Rome, that was oriented towards the self, to the contempt of God, and manifested itself in this selfishness, this human-centeredness, in its violence and its greed, and ultimately in its empire. This he opposes to the city of God, which a lot of people mistake for being the church. That is, unless you are in the church, and then you would never mistake it for being the city of God. The city of God is that those who are oriented towards God to the contempt of the self, and this manifests itself in mercy, justice, and ultimately the Sabbath, the peace. So Augustine's work, The City of God, would have a tremendous influence on the Western church and its concept of the church's place vis-a-vis the world. I use that term world because our own much more familiar dichotomy between the church and the state can't be addressed either to Augustine's age or even to the 17th century. It was beginning to emerge in the 17th century. The church and the state were one. The emperor, and then later the king, was not just the secular ruler, he was God's anointed. We sort of lose sight that in both periods, the chief governor of the church was not an archbishop, a pope, or or bishops, it was a layperson. And that layperson was the monarch, or the earlier period, the emperor. But this creates a dynamic that will continue to influence the church to this day, and that is of the church being other than the world, and the world being oriented to this time, this life, whereas the church is in some way taking a much more cosmic view. It is being, some might say, so heavenly minded it's no earthly good. So this then, particularly in the West, I can't speak as much to the East, but particularly in the West, this creates a marked distinction. You might even call it opposition between the church and the world, that would have different periods, different times when it would be much more pronounced than others, but generally remains. This idea that the priorities of the church are perhaps different from the priorities of the world, and in fact, as is argued by successive popes during the Middle Ages, ought to be subordinate to the world. I mean, to the church, for the church is speaking on behalf of an authority that will not end, whereas worldly authority will come to its end at the second coming. So, as we begin to move into our own period and to think about our own experience of the church and the state and state intervention, it's useful to begin by just noting that for the great majority of the church's history, that is a distinction that could not be made. And I can talk later about how in England, there's, England is different from most other places. People might say England's different from most other places for a whole range of reasons. But one of those things being that the church is established and so has a different relationship with the state. Whereas you can tell from my accent, I'm not from England. I'm from America, which has a very, very different notion of the relationship between the church and the state. And we may get into that later.
Yes. When you've been talking, Mark, I've been thinking about the kinds of interventions that the state has made in the life of the church, and they seem to me to make two kinds of contributions. You get perhaps what you might call a positive kind, certainly through the Tudor period, a number of demands for prayer, for events which go on in the life of the state, and whether it's because the monarch has been delivered from a plot, or prayers in time of war, litanies, and that sort of thing, and certainly prayers in time of famine. And there seems to be that kind of expectation of this powerful agency. I suppose the darker side to this is perhaps I don't think we perhaps really see it until Cromwell arrives on the scene in the middle of the 17th century. And in fact, the church lived a rather thinner time at that stage. Its liturgy was suppressed. The Book of Common Prayer was not used for somewhere between 11 and 15 years. And churches either were not open or opened with quite severe prohibitions on the way they behaved. I mean, I used to live next door to Ely Cathedral in Cambridgeshire, and Cromwell took vigorously against the practices of the Dean of Ely, who was quite a high church individual, and locked the cathedral.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and we were both at Durham, which was used as a place to hold Scottish prisoners, and you get some of this after the Reformation, when one of the people I researched when I was doing my master's degree was one of your predecessors, Bishop Bramall, the Archbishop of Armagh. And he, one of the first things he had to do when he arrived in Ireland that made him hugely unpopular with the local nobility was to chase their horses out of the churches, because the churches had been turned into stables. And the Tudor period it was, of course, notorious for churches falling into disrepair and nobility using them for their own uses, not to mention the whole suppression of the monasteries under Henry VIII to be wasted on his continental ambitions. So yeah, I mean, often, but I think it's a good point you raise about the prayers, because we do forget that. I mean, I can't make assumptions about you all, but certainly me coming from America, there is a general sense that the mixing up of the church and the state never ends well. But I think there's much in the Middle Ages that speaks against that, that it could be quite a fruitful relationship, and was based on an idea that we've sort of lost, that I think we would do well to recover. And that is that the spread of the gospel, the spread of the kingdom of God, was not just a kind of conversion of individual by individual, but it was a reclamation of the land, its people, and its sense of time. You get this very powerfully, I think, in Bede's ecclesiastical history. And when Augustine of Canterbury, not to be mistaken for Augustine of Hippo, arrives, and he wants to know what to do with the pagan shrines. He calls them temples, but the Anglo-Saxons didn't have temples. What to do with the shrines and their pagan high and holy days. Now, if he had followed in the footsteps of his predecessors, it would have been to abolish them all. But instead, he's advised by the Pope to turn the shrines into churches and to turn their high and holy days into Christian high and holy days. And there's this idea that he's not only baptizing the people in modern day Kent, and most importantly, their king, but he's laying claim to their sources of meaning. So by baptizing the people and their sources of meaning, he wasn't just claiming individuals in his own day, he was laying claim to that land for all time. He was, in a sense, setting up an outpost of the kingdom that was multi-generational, that would transcend the generations and wouldn't just be individual by individual. We on the other hand, especially in the post-Enlightenment West, have bought into such an idea that the purpose of Christianity is for a few faithful people to be whisked away to some ethereal place up in heaven, that it's lost its connection to the places where we live and the need to baptize those places. I personally think that the climate crisis is driving us back in that direction. But this is why it could include the state, because you were baptizing everything that makes human beings and human society what it is.
Mark, this is not an entirely legitimate leap to make from where you've taken us, but you did hint a bit earlier that you might say something about the nature of establishment as a rather unusual and in this day and age concept, and of course, once again unique. But that too has its element of encompassing, doesn't it? Where every soul within a particular pastoral area is under the care of that.
Yeah. No, it's I mean, one of the things I was a parish priest in the States for 13, 14 years before coming to England to do my doctorate. And then I was a parish priest in the Church of England for about 5 years before coming to Wales. And at first I couldn't quite get my head around being a priest in the established church. there was in some ways comical. I was looking for directions to someone's house to take him communion and couldn't find them because I was in this village where no house had a number. They all had names. So if you didn't know where that named house was, and so I stopped at somebody's house for direction. I heard all this great scrambling and swearing going on inside, and I thought, what on earth is going on? Well, the vicar had turned up, so she was quickly getting the tea on. Because when the vicar shows up, you need to be able to ask tea, vicar. But the thing I loved and still do about ministry here, as opposed to America, is doors are open to you everywhere. I mean, even in secular Britain, it still remains the case that I can, without needing extra special justification, I can go into schools. You know, America being known for being very religious, I couldn't go do an assembly in a state school. Perhaps in places in the South I could, but it's a wink wink because of the separation of church and state. Here in Brecon, I chair the local businesses as we're trying to cope with COVID and coming out of COVID. I would never do that in America. So because of that alignment of church and state, it gives clergy access to areas that frankly, I think a great many clergy over here don't take advantage of it because they're used to it. So that's, that creates a different environment that produces opportunities for the ministry.
And how do you find yourself coming to work in Ireland instead? You'd have found yourself, well, currently very exciting times because the 150th anniversary of the disestablishment of the church has just been celebrated, and Wales.
The 100th, yeah.
We've just come up for the 100th, and that, I suppose that asks similar sorts of, well, I don't know whether it asks similar questions in different ways or the same questions or different questions in similar ways, but my very brief experience of living within the Church of Ireland has been that the status of the church, certainly amongst its adherents, it still has a very honoured status and a very important local community function. I don't know whether Bishop Michael would bear that out, but which is rather unfair to call you into.
Well, just to comment briefly there, I think it's fascinating to live in a church that has been an establishment but no longer is an establishment. And of course, in the case of Ireland, there has been a major political change as well. To some extent, Welsh devolution has been slightly analogous, but there have been two very interesting volumes produced in recent months. One for the 150th anniversary of Irish disestablishment, one book of essays, and a rather similar book of essays marking the centenary of Welsh disestablishment, and to compare the two experiences and how the one learnt from the other. And to some extent, Wales was slightly more generously treated economically, but that's just an Irish piece of an Irish piece of begrudgery. But I think what's been most fascinating in Ireland was that the Church of Ireland, in a way, as Gladstone put it, was liberated from a false position in order to serve the kingdom of God better. And now we're finding that the Roman Catholic Church, which was never an establishment but behaved like it was, is now in a secular Ireland learning in ecumenical conversation from the Church of Ireland what it's like to have, as it were, become a liberated but reduced minority. And that's a fascinating ecumenical journey.
Thank you very much.
The interesting thing in Wales is because it was disestablished against its will, it's really been resisting that reality for 100 years now. And there's some aspects of the church in Wales that are, people come to us from the Church of England and say, "Oh, it's conservative here," including tremendous deference to bishops, which obviously Bishop I hardly support and commend. But the strange thing here that makes its disestablishment strange is that we are still bound as much by the Church of England by laws regarding baptisms, weddings, and funerals. So we remain in that regard as established as ever. And then the other strange thing is, if someone needs an archbishop's license in order to get married, it's not the Archbishop of Wales that we have to write to, it's the Archbishop of Canterbury. So it's Lambeth. So, and because of the powers of registry that he was given at the Reformation. So it's a strange existence, and I don't think Wales, Church in Wales, has even begun to live into the freedom it was given at disestablishment. It just desperately tries to be like the Church of England, with a lot less money.
And that is an absolutely fascinating insight. I didn't realize that the Archbishop of Canterbury had jurisdiction in the church in Wales, but
yeah, just that one matter. Yeah.
Yes. But since his name has been mentioned, and I suppose the symbolic heads of the church have particularly come under the microscope in this pandemic, because it's very difficult to know that you're doing the right thing. And I thought that what I would do is to go back and just look at some of the correspondence that had been in mouthpieces like the Church Times. There's one extraordinarily critical letter directed against the Archbishops of Canterbury and York for going beyond the law and insisting that churches be shut entirely at the beginning, which was a position they had to retreat from. And I don't know if you, as a member of a cathedral team, how have you found the legal interventions and provisions and hedgings around that have been imposed on you just in order to keep your establishment going?
Yeah. So the pandemic's been an interesting experience for everybody, obviously. Here at the cathedral, it's been an interesting time for me, not only in how do you respond to this as a cathedral, but becoming more aware of my own instincts as an American. Because initially I kept thinking, why, who the hell cares? I mean, it's putting it a bit strongly, but who the hell cares what the government says? We need to make these decisions ourselves based on good theological principles. And I quickly had to kind of unlearn that kind of Americanized Augustinianism that lurks within me. But it certainly hasn't been easy for anyone. We've managed to, except for a few weeks early on in the lockdown, we've managed to sustain worship in the cathedral throughout this with greatly reduced numbers. But I do, to kind of take it out of our own experience here into perhaps a shared experience, I have found it really interesting how we've had to adapt to really serious, almost unprecedented intrusions by the state into our worship. Perhaps the most blatant example is not using the common cup, but also when you can do a baptism. The thing I have struggled with the most is not being able to provide real pastoral care other than by telephone, in ways that over the length of a year has really impacted the life of the church. And I'm not sure, I think there's been times when we've chased these restrictions and requirements with theology, with mixed results, but I'm not sure the church as a whole has really approached and responded to what this pandemic has necessitated from us, with the robust theology that would not only allow us to make sure that what we're doing is sound and good, but could allow people to experience it with richness, even in the midst of suffering and hardship, encounter there something that perhaps speaks of the cross and our duty to bear our cross. Too often, I think, at least on this side of the Irish Sea, our language about this has sounded too much like what's coming out of the government or any other organization, and too little of the gospel.
That makes a very fascinating point. And I think that when we spoke earlier, you talked about the continuing tension between, on the one hand, thinking that the church ought to march hand in hand with the state, and on the other hand, how it ought to define its own position. And I think one of the things which has struck me has been the way the state is, perhaps not even too subtly, redefining the language we're allowed to use for our own practices. We talked earlier about baptism has become a life event. It's certainly not described in any government document as a sacrament.
Yeah. And then there's some amusing things. It's and we chatted about this earlier. People talking about and embracing spiritual communion, who never, from their tradition, would have discussed something like this in the past. I think I joked with you, Bridget, when you were talking about spiritual communion being discussed in the Church of Ireland. It's probably generations of Church of Ireland people who would be spinning in their grave over something like that. I've got here at the cathedral, we've got some very strong evangelicals who just have completely embraced the spiritual communion, completely unaware of the tradition that it grows out of. So, I mean, those sorts of things I always find interesting, because it shakes people out of their received beliefs and perhaps opens up the faith in ways that it didn't before. But I think you're right. I mean, one of the things I find really interesting, again, as an American, is one of the results of the close relationship between the church and the state in the British Isles is that being out of step with the government causes heartburn in ways that are completely foreign to me as an American. That they're not used to being out of sync with Parliament, and therefore society as well. In fact, there's a prominent theologian here in Britain, who will remain nameless, who argues very much that the Church of England should not profess beliefs that are too out of sync with what society, because it is the established church and should reflect the beliefs of society, the religious beliefs of society. But it, and of course, this has never really been a huge issue in Britain because of at least the state being nominally Christian. But I think increasingly, I describe the relationship between the Church of England and the state as being like that between Great Britain and the United States. Both Britain and the Church of England think of their relationships as being special relationships. But I'm not sure either the state or the United States really cares about the relationship as much as the other, as they think. But there you are. I mean, we carry the burden of our histories with us.
And I suppose this pandemic has given us perhaps some limited insight into the public as perhaps a kind of middle term, or at least a living entity between the church and the state. And I think one of the things that has fascinated me has been the letters to the Irish Times, where I've been consistently impressed by the fact that Catholics have sort of protested against their confinement and spoken for the restoration of access to be able to go to Mass. I haven't seen very many letters from members of the Church of Ireland or from members of the other churches. And it may simply be that I haven't been consistent enough about reading the correspondence. But it makes me just ask the question about when people feel they have the right or the motivations of public protest, and what it takes to get them to speak out in public.
Yeah. I mean, I was telling you earlier about my wife and I were able, in that brief, wonderful window when there were these travel corridors. It seems like a lifetime ago. We were able to go to the Pyrenees for a week of backpacking in the mountains. And the day before we came back, we stumbled upon the Catholic cathedral in Carcassonne, and they were just about to start Mass, so we went in. And this was long before here in the UK we had the restoration of organ, never mind singing. And there they were, not only was there the organ, but they were singing the Mass, and all socially distanced, but a fairly full cathedral. I mean, it must have been 200 people there. And after that period of time, to suddenly experience a sung Mass again, the tears just welled up. And I think I mean, there's been this huge, it's one of those, you can almost see it being assigned in future Christian ethics. When the central parts of your corporate identity as Christians are also enormous risks for the general public, i.e. gathering to worship, what is the correct answer to that? And our answers thus far, I think, have been built on the assumption that this would only be for a short period of time. I've always thought it would be an interesting thought experience is if we had a pandemic like this that went on for a decade. Yeah. What would we do? How would we respond? And there's not, some people would say, well, people need to be taken upon their own responsibility about going to church and worshiping. But then that raises the question that they can become super spreaders and take it to others. So it's a difficult one for us to face. And the interesting thing is that the church itself has survived pandemic after pandemic after pandemic, and our new normal is really the old normal. Normal life for human beings is, as with animals, is facing epidemics and pandemics and all sorts of nasty things that can kill us. The difference this time is that we understand germs and spread and all these things much better. But then how do we shape our life as the church when those central things that allow us corporately to be Christians then become a threat? And I'm not sure we've really answered that.
You talked earlier about Augustine of Canterbury having to redefine the meaning of what he found in order to incorporate it into what he was trying to build.
Yeah.
And I suppose maybe it's too early to have the conversation of what kinds of redefinitions of our own lives we will have to undergo. But that is a very interesting thought experiment that this might, should, heaven forbid that it should go on that long. But what would we be conscious of? What would we actually just forget in our practice? I'm wondering whether any members of the audience would like to ask any questions or make comments at this stage.
See, we've put them all to sleep already.
Jean, someone's still awake. Jean, you turn your mic on.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, when you were talking about establishment, it struck me that that's caused there to be a very big difference between in England between Anglican and Catholic schools. After the 44 Education Act, most of the Catholic schools were voluntary aided, and the governors had control over the appointment of head deputy and head of RE, who were normally Catholics, and they taught their own Catholic syllabus.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the Anglican schools, as I understand it, are there for their local community, and they teach the agreed syllabus. So it's a very different vision of what they're doing, but it's because of establishment, I think.
Yeah. And I have to admit, as an American, I still haven't got my head around it. I mean, even though I've been doing collective worships here for ages now, since 2011, when I went into parish ministry here. And I'm in an Anglican setting. I'm still not, my experience, it depends tremendously on the head teacher, how doctrinal you can be. So, I mean, here we've got Priory School next door to the cathedral, which is a state primary school, church school. I mean, really, there's no limits. I mean, I'm basically taken through a catechism of sorts, but that's largely based on my personal relationship with the head teacher. Whereas elsewhere, it's been, Christianity reduced to respect and tolerance, and things that I think is really these are much more useful to the state than necessarily forming people as Christians. So yeah, I think you're right there.
George Woodman has a question. If you turn your mic on, George.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Good. Just all I was going to say really was, I appreciate, Mark, your point very much about the need to think through theologically. I have to say that the thing in the last year that actually I found hardest was during the 4 months when our churches churches here were to open again. I was actually much more aware of impaired communion. In one sense, in my parish church, arriving on a Sunday morning to be greeted by a church warden with a temperature gun and having it pointed at my, and I actually didn't felt that practically it wasn't very effective, because I thought actually when they'd been through it made people more careless. But that's another point. But theologically, I have to say I found it extremely offensive. But theologically, it had not clearly, the church and the parish had not thought it through at all. And in fact, I am more conscious of being in communion with the wider church when I say morning prayer on the Sunday morning, and using the forms of using the set lessons as set from the lectionary. I feel more at home, really. So I think there are things that need to be thought through, and maybe link into your thought experiment.
Yeah, and thank God for the angels and archangels and all the company of heaven. I think you're right. I mean, my first thought was it was a good thing we didn't try the temperature thing here, because the cathedral's so cold that as soon as you enter, your body temperature drops by about 10 degrees. So it wouldn't have caused anybody. But I mean, our equivalent to that here was over eager, perhaps over anxious stewards, so intent on making sure that when people came in, they did track and trace, they were 2 meters apart, that they sat in specific chairs, that they didn't gather to talk, and when the service was over, they went out the right service. that the whole experience for your typical worshiper here became terribly inhospitable. And I kept saying to them, yes, we need to follow restrictions, but you can do it with a smile. You don't need to be so regimented about it. And you know, it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about, but one of the things I have found interesting is we haven't really been dealing with just state intervention. It's been state intervention filtered through the whole spectrum of people's anxieties. Mm-hmm. So here, you know, very often our decisions have been guided, I would argue, more than they should have been by our more anxious people. I can say that because I'm on the other end of the spectrum. But what I found is interesting, and not helped by how often the restrictions change, or the Church in Wales, when it puts out its guidance, you almost need to take a class in canon law to work your way through the document. That soon it becomes unanchored from the actual guidelines and restrictions, and becomes anchored more on what people's anxieties and how they have interpreted or remembered or misremembered these restrictions through their anxieties. But you know, we're human beings, and we've had to kind of think our way through this on the hoof, as it were. Nor, and I can say this as a theologian, do I think we at least, again, on this side of the Irish Sea, form clergy and congregations with sufficient theology to think through these things theologically. And so we end up largely thinking through it in much the same way as the world does.
Thank you very much.
Bridget, if I may just leap in here. Mark, I appreciate what you just said in terms of perhaps us not equipping the faithful and the whole church to think through these things as rigorously as they should, especially in light of what George said in terms of his experience going to church and being, staring down the barrel of a temperature gun. It really does impose on us the necessity of asking what constitutes communion. You know, we spoke about, and of course the overarching title of this whole series has to do with communion of both kinds, the withholding of the chalice in light of the potential for spread. And I think the last time we probably really asked that question was in the era of the advent of AIDS, because people, before they understood that disease, were very nervous about the potential for spread and what that meant. But fortunately, I think we got through that question quickly and with compassion. That said, we might have spent some time then asking what constitutes communion, and it's something I think we failed to do. Certainly from my point of view, and through an experience I had over the summer, being asked to assist at a cathedral, very high sort of density cathedral in London, where liturgies were served on rotation to accommodate all of the people who wish to attend and still maintain the appropriate social distance. It felt like such a cold experience to me. So although from an Orthodox point of view, we would have identified, the body and blood being present in the sacrament. I could not help when I walked away, but wonder if there wasn't something missing that somehow diminished that experience. And I think it really does behoove the whole church, Anglican, Roman Catholic, Orthodox alike, to ask what the theological and spiritual implications are for the full nature of communion, because somehow, however objectively we might identify Christ's presence with us, it was almost certainly diminished. So I think you're just, I know I've just rambled, but you're pointing out something of extreme importance, and I think it corresponds very nicely with what George had to say.
Thank you. And it may be that Father Timothy will shed some more light on this. I see your hands up.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether I can add more light, but different dimension. I think Mark was speaking about people's anxieties and the way in which that was mediated, and the way in which the church services were conducted. I think from the Orthodox perspective, the opposite was experienced. And bear in mind that a large proportion of the Orthodox communities in the UK and Europe are migrant communities, and therefore quite disconnected from the government messaging and communications, and from state interference. I could talk about Symphonia and you know, the theory and theology of state partnership in Russia and Greece, but here in the UK, a lot of those communities were and are still very disconnected from the government messaging, and from the theory and the reality of the pandemic, and that led to serious devastation within the Greek Cypriot community in London. Very high levels of deaths and illnesses. It led to significant numbers of clergy and lay people dying across Europe, to the Patriarch of Serbia himself, and a number of senior clergy contracting COVID from the very funeral of the Patriarch of Serbia. So the practices of the church, while we tried to stay behaving almost as normal, it was too normal in the extent to which we were trying to manage the opposite of anxiety, which was flagrant disregard or disconnection from the realities of the pandemic, certainly in the UK. A number of diaspora communities suffering quite significant hotspots. So and then being, for me as a British person within the Orthodox community, seeing Anglican and Catholic communities and other Protestant communities who are fully aware and fully communicated and fully connected to the government messaging, shutting down and being extremely restrictive about their situation, and then Orthodox communities being very much the opposite. So, and there was a very difficult situations across all of the communities, Russian and Greek and Serbian and Romanian, trying to manage and communicate with one another in ways that we've probably never done before, trying to understand what is the messaging. We're not under kind of government direction or episcopal direction in the UK necessarily. Most of our bishops are abroad, and therefore in a European context or old country context, saying this should happen, this should happen. You know, the whole discussion we had last week about communion spoons, that raged across the world, and then we had to try and figure out how to implement it here in the UK. So it's a very different perspective, I think, for us.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I one of the things I muse on from time to time, and again, I don't have any answers to this, but one of the closest parallels I can think of to our situation, where things that we could do could have tremendous adverse impact on the wider society, and along with that, the fear that would then rebound on the church, but with anger at the church not doing things that were unsafe. The closest parallel I can think of that in a strange way was the plight of Christians in the Roman Empire, when there was the belief that when the city was hit with a famine or pestilence, that this was the punishment of the gods for allowing Christians to worship and thus dishonor the gods. And so they would have felt the kind of pressure that we feel to conform in order to avoid the anger of wider society. Now obviously we know that the pagan gods weren't inflicting these things upon the Roman cities because of Christians worshiping. But it's, you know, I do kind of wonder, again, with that thought experiment, if we were locked perpetually in something where the essentials of our faith would prevent us, would cause risk to wider society, what would we choose to do? And I think what troubles me as much as our not asking that question, and you especially saw this in the Church of England, is those kinds of questions seem to bring out the worst in us, particularly if you're on Twitter, which I personally think all clergy should be banned from. But and you know, I've often said in terms of the context of this discussion about state intervention, that one thing social media has proven is that when clergy are ordained, they are not given, among the grace that they're given is not political insight. That the clergy will spout out the daftest things on the social media and pretend like it's the voice of God. But we seem unable to tackle these kinds of questions in a way that, shall I say, smells of incense rather than sulfur. That speaks of other realities, and instead we tend to just slog it out in exactly the same way that the world slogs it out. And I think our inability to do that compromises our witness to the world. I mean, what made the Christian witness in the early church? It wasn't that they were squabbling with each other when they were led into the arenas. It was because they were singing and rejoicing in the midst of all that. And perhaps one of the things we need to relearn in the midst of these hardships and difficulties is how to continue to sing the Lord's song in a new land.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, I'm not sure whether Jackie Minnock's going to respond directly to that, because I know she's itching to ask a question, but thank you. great response to the question.
No, it wasn't actually, it was just a comment I had. How to phrase this? Just as part of our Christian duty to each other, are we not doing good in staying away, you know, as not congregating for mass or for services? Can that not be as part of our Christian duty? And that I really don't believe that it's forever, and please God, we'll be all able to go back soon, but that we keep each other safe. And is this not part of a theological response either as well? But that's my comment, maybe not a question, just a
No. I mean, I agree completely, and that's what creates the conundrum. I personally would like, I mean, I two responses. First is just a personal quirk on my part, and I personally dislike, and just saying this is going to make it a bit stronger than I probably feel, but I think unqualified, the idea of safe, is problematic. You know, for most of our, for a great deal of our history, and in many places nowadays, being an active Christian is never a safe thing. So I think we just need to be a little careful we don't make safety an idol. Having said that, I mean, obviously we need to do everything we can to avoid becoming people who endanger other people and their health. But I think, I'm not sure we've taken sufficient stock of safety being more than keeping them alive. And what makes me say this is one, the number of the elderly people in our community here at the cathedral who have mentally declined considerably during the past year. I'm beginning to wonder if coming out of COVID, we're going to see a huge upsurge in dementia, and largely due to people living in isolation. I mean, we know mental health, there are real issues with that, and due to people living, you know, we've got people here at the cathedral who have hardly stepped foot out of their house in a year. And then the other thing is, I don't know what it's like, what the rules are like where you are, but here we have not been allowed to take communion to people in hospital. We had one instance. It was our sacristan here who was dying, and the Archbishop basically gave me permission to take her communion in hospital. And I passed row after row after row of people dying alone. And she, who had been an ardently faithful Anglican Catholic her entire life, the last 5 months of her life didn't receive communion, and only received it a few times in the last few weeks of her life. And I'm not sure we've worked out how to weigh these things against each other. And I suspect we won't know how to weigh them against each other, except in hindsight, when we see the ramifications of all this. I was just listening to a report this morning where there's increasing concern about very small children who have missed out on the socialization, and that these may manifest themselves in some pretty severe mental health problems in the future. I have a friend who's really concerned about his daughter, who's now afraid of other people because he's seen people recoil, or she's seen people recoil from each other over a period of time. So there's all these things that I think, because we can't measure them in the way that we can measure death toll or number of cases or number of people in hospital, that we just kind of set them aside and kind of express kind of vague concerns about them. But because we live in a society that does everything by measurement, we don't quite know how to grapple with this. And I think insofar as we've been unable to grapple with that, we've not been properly caring and pastoral to the people around us.
Just a very thought-provoking note on which to end, and it makes me think whether the kinds of conversations we've had tonight should go on, but in a much more interdisciplinary way, so that the medics and the politicians join in too. But thank you all, Mark, to you particularly, and to everybody who's offered their contributions. It's been a really most fascinating evening. And again, James, thank you to you. Next week, we're going to be talking in broad terms about the choreography of the pandemic Eucharist, and we've got Canon Angela Tilby, who may be known to some of you as a broadcaster on Radio 4 and a writer, and Canon Joe Spreadbury from Portsmouth Cathedral, who'll be talking us through that. So have a very good evening to all of you.